If you're a longtime viewer of Rerez, you likely know that I'm a pretty big fan of arcade machines from the past, and one of the only reasons why we've never gone out and covered a lot of them is because, well, they're very old, hard to come by, and they are very, very big. But a company called Super Impulse sent us their entire range of arcade systems, but there's one thing about them that's pretty crazy. They're called tiny arcades because they're really tiny. Let's take a closer look.
We received 7 of these tiny arcades, and each one was designed to look like the original arcade systems that you would have found in arcades back in the 70s and 80s. They all have the exact same plastic body design and have the exact same kinds of controls and screens. Nothing really changes on the outside, but it's the games inside and the stickers on the outside that change from game to game. The stickers are pretty detailed and mimic the original designs you would have found on the sides of their original cabinets. But what I really like is that the marquee on the top of every single machine actually lights up just like the originals. What isn't like the original machines though are the controls. Both the left and right buttons on the side are very clicky and responsive despite being really small, and the joystick itself is a little bit awkward to use simply because it is so tiny, but it does feel like it works fairly well. I was expecting the joystick to be very squishy and unresponsive, but luckily it really doesn't have that problem. Even though it is really small, it actually has a bit of a click to it that gives you that kind of feel and feedback every time you move it around. Considering the size they're working with here, I don't think anyone could have made better controls. At the base of every tiny arcade is a single down-firing speaker that seems to be loud enough to hear in most situations. Each system also has the exact same 1.5-inch backlit screen so that you can see it in the dark when you're playing it at night. And perhaps most importantly, every single arcade runs off of 3 AAA batteries, and it can attach to your keychain because that's how small these things really are. These arcades are small enough that if you cut open a can of pop, you could actually fit it inside one. We're not going to do that here, but you can see just how small it is when they're side to side. So tiny arcades are, well, very tiny, and they seem to be built to last with some good materials, and the controls themselves are also pretty impressive, but does that mean that you're going to be getting a good gameplay experience while trying to play video games on them? Well, let's take a closer look. First up, let's talk about Space Invaders. The game itself is a pretty basic one from the 1970s that has you moving from the left and right on the screen, shooting at an oncoming alien force. The gameplay here is pretty good, but it also is very basic due to the age of the title. But of all the tiny arcade systems we're going to be taking a look at, this one is by far the most accurate in recreating the original arcade experience. Space Invaders itself isn't a very visually complex game, making use of very simplified assets. These graphics look great on the tiny arcade screen as they come in very sharp and clear. Something you might not know about the original Space Invaders cabinet is that it didn't use a color screen. Instead, what they had was a cellophane overlay that went over top of the screen that colored the bottom portion of the screen green and the top portion a reddish orange. In other recreations of Space Invaders, sometimes you'll notice that they miss out on that one little detail. But I'm happy to note that when I was paying attention to the tiny arcade system here, you could tell that they knew what they were doing. When you shoot your spacecraft's laser, it goes through the color spectrum and changes from one color to another to the end. This means that they added that little feature because they knew that that was something in the original arcade. It sounds good and it plays good, and for something this small, it's pretty shocking that it got as close as it did. Now let's check out Galaxian. Galaxian is very similar to the way that you'd play Space Invaders, but in this game the enemies tend to move around a lot more and you've got much more impressive graphics on display. In the tiny arcade release of this game, I noticed that the graphics quality had been reduced a bit. What they were doing was taking the arcade original and bringing it down to a smaller resolution screen, and by doing that, they kinda had to compress some of the assets. That's not the biggest problem in the world though, because while you're playing this game at a normal viewing distance, it really does seem to look fine. A problem that was harder for me to look past, however, was the fact that the game seems to be running a lot slower. There seems to be a loss in visual details like animations of the ships flying around, and the background star field seems to be running at a lower frame rate. I also noticed that while I was moving around my spaceship and firing at the same time, it would kind of stutter a bit, not giving me that smooth movement that the game was known for. But due to the tiny arcade size, it might just be better to have the game running at this speed. However, I would have preferred to have an option to change it to be more accurate to the original release. But it doesn't stop at Galaxian because there is a tiny arcade version of its sequel, Galaga. Unfortunately though, all the criticisms I had for Galaxian are pretty much replicated here. It's the same idea and the exact same problems. I would argue though that the loss of frame rate and lower quality animations is even more pronounced here than in Galaxian. When the enemies fly into formation at the beginning of each stage, you'll notice a loss of frames immediately, but something that's even more noticeable is that after a couple stages while they're flying to formation, they're supposed to shoot down at you, but that never really seems to happen here. During the very brief sequence when your spaceship is being abducted, you should be able to fire, but in this one that doesn't seem to happen. Where the tiny arcade version of Galaxian is close enough to the original that it's still fun to play, I feel that Galaga is too much of a departure, and hardcore fans of the series might be put off by the way it feels. For people unfamiliar with the original Galaga, they might have a lot of fun with it, but personally, it's just not for me. Now let's take a look at PacMan. Just like Galaxian and Galaga, the graphics have been minimized down due to the lower resolution of the screen, but a lot of the gameplay has pretty much stayed intact. The cutscenes that play when you complete every couple of stages are still present, but there are noticeable changes. For instance, the game seems to play a lot slower than the original does. And another thing I noticed was that whenever you picked up a power pellet, the sound effect that plays when the ghosts turn blue doesn't last as long as it should. These are just minor gripes though, and the slow speed is kind of welcomed when you're considering how small the screen really is. One issue I noticed on occasion is that when I would eat a ghost, it would return to the center of the screen, and sometimes it just wouldn't leave. Usually they leave really quickly, but once in a while it would just stay there or just take an incredibly long time to leave the center box. This is something that shouldn't happen while you're playing PacMan, but when it gets harder later on, it's kind of a welcome problem. Of course, if you're going to make a tiny arcade of PacMan, you also need to make a tiny arcade of Miss Pac-Man. And these games play pretty much identically, the only difference is that Miss Pac-Man has a difference up in stages. All the positives and all the negatives I mentioned with Pac-Man are replicated here. The only difference though is that if I had to choose between Pac-Man and Miss Pac-Man, I'd be going with Miss Pac-Man simply because I like the maze to change every so often. But even though there are some issues, I feel that these games are close enough to the original arcade releases that they're still really fun to play. Now let's check out Frogger. Now of course, I'm a big fan of Frogger from way back when. I enjoy the way the game plays, and I think this version here is pretty close to the original. It does have a little bit of a slowdown like we've seen with the other games I've mentioned, but it's close enough that I think you'll still enjoy your time with it. The only problem I noticed with Frogger was that the music seemed to be off. For one reason or another, not only did it not sound like the music you would have heard in the original release, but it also sounded like it was muffled, like somebody was holding the speaker over a blanket or something. I suppose there might be some gamers out there that wouldn't know the difference and don't care what the music sounds like, but for me personally, I just wanted it to sound a little bit clearer and a whole lot better. And the final cabinet we're looking at is Dig Dug. Now I'm very happy with how Dig Dug turned out because it is as close to the original as I think you're gonna get in the tiniest form factor you're gonna find. Now there are a couple of differences here, but the speed isn't an issue. This plays just as fast as the original, and it seems to be as close to the original in terms of gameplay. The only difference I really found though was that when the music was playing when your character moved, well, it just kept playing all the time. In the original Dig Dug in the arcades, when your character would move, that was the only time that the music played, and when he stopped, the music would stop. But in this version, the music just keeps playing throughout, and maybe that's kind of an improvement. I like hearing the music all the way through, and whenever you had to hear it stop because you were stopping for strategy, it just kind of held you from actually listening to the music all the way through. So for some, they might see this as a downgrade, but for me, it's kind of a plus. While all the other games we talked about today feature primarily darker backgrounds, Dig Dug is different. It's got a very colorful screen, and I think it's really cool to look at when you're looking at something so tiny on a very small arcade system. Having looked at all the tiny arcade machines, I really wanted to rank them from least favorite to most favorite, and it plays out like this. At the very bottom, I'd have to choose Galaga. Personally, I just don't feel Galaga works as well as the original arcade release, and some players might find it very challenging and not very fun. Next on the list would be Galaxian, simply because I feel that it's not as fun to play as the original, but it's a lot more fun to play than the tiny arcade version of Galaga. After that, I would choose Space Invaders. Even though Space Invaders was very accurate to the original arcade release, I feel that compared to the rest of the arcade systems here, it simply just doesn't have the gameplay to match. Next up is Frogger. Even though I had some issues with the music, I feel that the the gameplay itself is a lot more fun to play than Space Invaders. Above that would be PacMan, because even though it's a little bit slower to play, I still feel that it retains most of the original ideas that made PacMan so much fun to play originally. But of course, Miss Pac-Man beats out the original Pac-Man simply because the games are virtually identical, but you have a switch up on mazes, which makes the game, in my opinion, a lot more fun to play. And that leaves my top pick, Dig Dug. Dig Dug was just so much fun to play in the Tiny Arcade format, and I really feel that if anyone out there is going to try these things at any point, they should try Dig Dug first. I don't think they'll be disappointed by it. I believe that it's the small form factor that makes these tiny arcades as interesting as they are, and I believe there's going to be a lot of gamers out there that take these things with them everywhere they go because they're simply that portable.
I think there's going to be a lot of gamers out there buying these things that are expecting kind of the same experience they got in the original arcades. And I don't think you're going to get exactly quite that, but you're going to get something that's a close approximation of that. And simply because they're so small, you're never actually going to get the exact same experience, but that's okay. I think casual gamers are going to like this, and I think a couple of the hardcore out there are going to enjoy these as well too.